What happens when a simple flight turns into a public spectacle? For Barron Trump, a routine trip spiraled into chaos. But no one expected the storm that followed when Melania arrived. The loudspeaker crackled as a final boarding call echoed through the bustling terminal of Dallas Love Field Airport. Barron Trump sat near gate C-12. His tall frame folded into a chair that seemed too small for his stature. He kept his head down, scrolling through his phone, trying to blend into the crowd of travelers rushing to make their flights. At 17, his life was anything but ordinary. Yet he had mastered the art of staying under the radar in public. But today, that effort was about to be tested. A gate agent, an older man with sharp features and an air of impatience, approached the area. His eyes landed on Barron, who was in the priority boarding section. Something about the teenager's aloof demeanor seemed to rub him the wrong way. The agent's voice cut through the ambient noise. "Excuse me, young man," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. "Are you sure you're in the right boarding group?" Barron looked up, startled but calm. "Yes, I am. I have a first-class ticket." His voice was steady but polite, his upbringing shining through. The agent scrutinized him for a moment, his gaze flickering to Barron's phone, his casual hoodie, and sneakers. "Can I see your ticket?" Barron hesitated. It wasn't the first time he'd been singled out for no apparent reason. But something about this man's tone felt different, more aggressive. He handed over his boarding pass, his name clearly displayed on the screen. "Barron Trump," the agent read aloud, pausing. His expression shifted, but instead of backing off, his demeanor hardened. "Wait here." Passengers around them began to take notice, their whispers a low hum of curiosity. Barron felt the heat rise in his cheeks, but he kept his expression neutral. Moments later, the agent returned, flanked by a supervisor. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket," the agent said firmly. "You'll need to step aside while we sort this out." Barron frowned. "What issue? I booked this ticket weeks ago." The supervisor cut in. "We're handling it, sir. Please step away from the gate." As Barron reluctantly moved aside, he could feel the stares of fellow passengers. Some pulled out their phones, recording the interaction. The murmurs grew louder. His frustration simmered, but he bit his tongue, unwilling to make a scene. But the situation wasn't about to de-escalate. It was just getting started. Barron leaned against a nearby column, watching the other passengers board without issue. The glances from the gate staff and murmurs from the crowd felt heavier with each passing second. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure of what was taking so long. Was this about his last name? Or was it something else entirely? He wasn't the type to jump to conclusions, but this was starting to feel personal. After several minutes, the supervisor returned, his expression still stern. "We're unable to verify your identity through the system. Do you have another form of identification?" Barron furrowed his brow. "My passport is in my carry-on bag. You didn't even check it." The supervisor hesitated, clearly caught off guard by the logical response, but instead of backing down, he doubled down. "Sir, this isn't just about ID. There are procedures we need to follow." "Procedures?" Barron asked, his tone calm but tinged with disbelief. "What procedures? I've flown through this airport dozens of times without an issue." The gate agent from earlier interjected. "We've had some irregularities lately. You're not being singled out." But the look in his eyes betrayed him. Barron wasn't buying it, and neither were a few passengers nearby who began muttering among themselves. A woman in her late 40s holding a toddler on her hip spoke up. "What's the problem? He's just a kid with a ticket. Let him board." The supervisor ignored her, focusing instead on Barron. "You'll need to wait here while we conduct a further review. If you don't comply, we'll have to escalate the matter." "Escalate?" Barron echoed, his patience wearing thin. "What exactly are you escalating? I've done nothing wrong." As if on cue, a pair of airport security officers appeared. Barron's chest tightened, not from fear but from sheer disbelief at how quickly the situation was spiraling. The officers stood on either side of him, their presence drawing even more attention. Phones were out now, recording every second. "Sir, please come with us," one officer said in a measured tone. "We just need to ask you a few questions." Barron exhaled, his jaw tightening as he grabbed his carry-on bag. Fine. He followed them into a small, sterile room near the gate, the whispers and camera flashes following him like a storm cloud. Inside, the officers asked him to sit at a table. The air felt colder, heavier, as one officer began flipping through his passport. "This is ridiculous," Barron muttered under his breath, shaking his head. One of the officers looked up. "We're just following protocol, son." But that word, protocol, was starting to sound like an excuse for something more sinister, and the more they probed, the more Barron began to feel the weight of an unspoken bias in the room. But what Barron didn't know was that someone else was already on her way, and she wasn't happy. In the back seat of a black SUV weaving through Dallas traffic, Melania Trump sat poised, her phone in hand. She had planned a quick trip to surprise her son at the airport after his flight. But as her phone buzzed with a flood of text messages and social media alerts, her expression shifted from calm to concern. One message caught her attention. "Something's going on with Barron at the airport. People are posting videos." Her fingers flew across the screen, pulling up a short clip that showed Barron surrounded by security, being led away from the gate. She replayed it twice, her brow furrowing deeper with each pass. "Driver, please hurry," she said, her voice cool but firm. Meanwhile, back at the airport, Barron sat in the small room, staring at the blank wall in front of him. The officers had stepped out to verify his credentials, leaving him alone to stew in silence. He didn't know who to call or what to do. His hands rested on the table, fingers tapping lightly, a rhythm he didn't even realize he was making. Suddenly the door opened and the supervisor from earlier walked in. "We're still working on clearing up the situation," he said, avoiding eye contact. "It shouldn't be much longer." "How much longer?" Barron asked, his tone sharp. "You've had all my information for almost an hour." The supervisor hesitated, then mumbled something about procedures again before retreating. Barron exhaled in frustration, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't just about a ticket or ID anymore. It felt like something deeper. Outside the terminal, Melania's SUV pulled up to the curb. She stepped out, her posture commanding despite her understated outfit. Heads turned as she strode through the airport, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She didn't need to announce her presence. People simply moved aside as she passed. Approaching the gate where the incident had occurred, she was met with a flurry of murmurs and whispers. Passengers recognized her instantly, and some even pointed toward the area where security had taken Barron. "Excuse me," she said to a nearby airline employee. "Where is my son?" The employee blinked, stunned by the directness of her question. "Ma'am, let me check." Melania didn't wait for a response. She moved forward, her eyes scanning for any sign of Barron. When she spotted the room where he was being held, her pace quickened. She reached the door just as the two officers returned to Barron. They froze when they saw her, their expressions a mix of surprise and apprehension. "What is going on here?" she asked, her voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded an answer. "Mrs. Trump," one officer began, fumbling for words. "This is just a standard protocol." "Protocol," she interrupted, her gaze icy. "You are holding my son in a small room with no explanation. What kind of protocol is this?" The supervisor appeared behind her, his face pale. "Mrs. Trump, this is all just a misunderstanding. We were trying to verify his ticket." "A misunderstanding?" Her voice remained steady but her tone sharpened. "Do you treat all passengers this way? Or just the ones you decide to single out?" The room fell silent, the tension so thick it felt like time itself had stopped. But this silence wouldn't last for long. Melania was about to demand answers they couldn't provide. Melania's gaze didn't waver as she stood in the doorway, her presence commanding the room. Barron glanced at his mother, his relief visible but restrained. He straightened in his chair, his shoulders no longer slumped. "Mrs. Trump," the supervisor stammered, beads of sweat forming on his brow. "Please understand. We were just trying to ensure everything was in order." "This isn't in order," Melania interrupted, her tone as sharp as the silence in the room. "You had his ticket, his passport, and his name. What else do you need? A written invitation to board the plane?" The supervisor flinched but tried to recover. We flagged his name in the system, and that required additional checks." Melania tilted her head slightly, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Flagged? Because he's my son? Or because someone decided he didn't belong in first class today?" The officers exchanged uneasy glances, neither wanting to be the one to respond. The tension was palpable and everyone in the room felt it. Finally, one of the officers cleared his throat. "It's standard procedure, ma'am. We weren't aware of his relation to you until just now." Melania's eyes narrowed. "So, this is about his last name." The supervisor opened his mouth to protest, but she raised a hand to stop him. "Save your excuses. I want to speak to someone in charge, now." The man hesitated but eventually nodded, stepping out of the room to make a call. Melania turned her attention to Barron, her expression softening as she approached him. "Are you okay?" she asked quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. Barron nodded, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Yeah, I'm fine. They've just been wasting my time." Melania gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before turning back to the officers. "Let me make something clear," she said, her voice steady and composed. "You have humiliated my son in front of dozens of people. This is not about protocol or procedures. This is about respect, or the lack of it." One of the officers shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Trump will make this right. We'll ensure he boards the next flight." "You think this is about getting on a flight?" she cut in, her voice rising slightly for the first time. "This is about accountability. I don't want apologies whispered behind closed doors. I want them where they belong. Out there, where this all started." The supervisor returned, now accompanied by a higher-ranking airport official. The official extended a hand which Melania pointedly ignored. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding," he began. "I assure you, we'll be reviewing this incident and taking appropriate action." "Appropriate action," Melania echoed, raising an eyebrow. "Does that include addressing the staff who escalated this without cause? Or reviewing the footage that shows exactly how this began?" The official paled. "We can certainly pull up the footage, ma'am." "Do it," she said firmly. "And do it now." The room seemed to shrink as everyone waited for the official to act. A few moments later, the supervisor returned with a laptop. The grainy footage showed Barron at the gate, sitting quietly before being approached by the gate agent. It captured the entire exchange, from the unnecessary questioning to the escalating tension that led to Barron being removed. Melania watched the footage in silence, her face unreadable. When it ended, she turned to the supervisor. "You owe my son a public apology." "Of course," the man stammered. "We'll address it right away." But Melania wasn't done yet. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about sending a message that no one should endure such treatment, regardless of their name or status. The supervisor, now visibly shaken, led the way back to the boarding gate. Melania walked beside him, her stride measured and unyielding, with Barron following close behind. The tension in the terminal was almost tangible. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier commotion were still lingering, their curiosity piqued by the sudden return of the teenager and his mother. As they reached the gate, the supervisor stepped forward, cleared his throat, and addressed the crowd. His voice wavered slightly, but he pressed on. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to take a moment to apologize for a situation that occurred earlier today. A misunderstanding involving one of our passengers, Mr. Barron Trump, led to actions that were unnecessary and inappropriate." A murmur rippled through the crowd, with some passengers exchanging looks of surprise and others nodding in agreement. The supervisor glanced at Melania, whose steady gaze urged him to continue. "I want to make it clear," he said, his voice firming up, "that this young man did nothing wrong. The incident was entirely due to an error on our part, and for that, we deeply regret the inconvenience and discomfort caused." Barron stood quietly, his hands in his pockets, his expression neutral. But inside he felt the weight of the moment, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small in a public setting. Melania stepped forward, her presence drawing the attention of every person in the gate area. "Thank you for your words," she began, her tone measured but resolute. "But words are not enough. This is not just about my son. It is about the principle of treating every individual with respect and dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from. The room fell silent, her words cutting through the air like a blade. My son may carry a name that draws attention, but he is also a person. A young man who deserves to be treated fairly, as should every passenger in this airport. Let this be a reminder to all of us to pause and think before we act, to remember that respect is not earned by status, but by the humanity we all share. The crowd erupted in applause, some passengers even standing in solidarity. The supervisor lowered his head, his face red with embarrassment. For a moment, the airport buzzed with a newfound energy, not of judgment or division, but of unity. As the applause subsided, a woman with a toddler approached Barron and Melania. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what you went through," she said softly. "It wasn't right." Melania smiled graciously, her eyes warm. "Thank you. That means a lot." Barron nodded, grateful but still processing the whirlwind of events. But this moment of clarity wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a conversation about respect, equality, and accountability that would resonate far beyond the walls of this terminal. As the gate area began to settle, Barron and Melania were escorted to the lounge while waiting for the next flight. The airline staff, now walking on eggshells, went out of their way to ensure their comfort. Offers of refreshments and priority boarding were made, but Melania waved them off politely. For her, this wasn't about compensation. It was about the principle. Barron sat across from her, his hands clasped in his lap. "I didn't expect all that," he said quietly, breaking the silence. Melania looked up from her phone, her expression softening. "You handled yourself well," she replied. "It's not easy to stay calm in moments like that." Barron shrugged. "I've dealt with stuff like this before, just not so public." Melania leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "And that's exactly the problem," she said. "No one should have to get used to being treated unfairly. Whether it's you, me, or someone no one recognizes, respect should never depend on a last name or appearance." Barron nodded, his mother's words sinking in. "You think they'll actually change anything after this?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Maybe not today, but moments like these add up. People notice. And sometimes, all it takes is one person standing up to make others think twice before they act." As they waited, Melania pulled out her phone and began typing. Moments later, a tweet appeared on her profile. "Today, my son experienced something no one should have to endure. Being judged before being understood. This serves as a reminder to treat everyone with dignity, no matter their name or background. Respect is universal. Let's do better." The post quickly gained traction, sparking discussions online about bias, accountability, and respect in public spaces. Barron scrolled through the replies, some supportive, others critical, but most echoing the sentiment that fairness and dignity should be non-negotiable. When it was finally time to board the flight, Barron and Melania walked to the gate together. The staff, now noticeably more accommodating, guided them through without issue. As they settled into their seats, Melania glanced at her son, who had already put on his headphones, staring out the window. She smiled faintly, thinking about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about Barron, it was about every person who had ever been made to feel small, dismissed, or unworthy. Moments like these were opportunities to teach, to push for change, and to remind the world that respect was not a privilege, but a right. As the plane taxied down the runway, Melania closed her eyes, her mind replaying the day's events. It hadn't been an easy experience, but it was one she hoped would leave a lasting impact. Not just on those involved, but on everyone who heard the story. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons come from moments of adversity, and the way we respond can inspire others to rise above prejudice and embrace kindness. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who might need a reminder about the importance of respect and fairness. Let's make a difference together, one conversation at a time. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire reflection and change.